These days, the central line of the London Underground is a pretty big deal. It's more than 120 years old, it's the longest line, it runs from the suburbs of West London to the countryside of Essex, it passes through the city and the West End, and is the second busiest tube line after the Northern. But if certain people had had their way, it wouldn't have existed at all. And by certain people, I mean just about everybody. So a little bit of background. In the 1880s, construction began on a new type of railway, the City and South London. This was the first deep-level underground railway, and it opened up all sorts of possibilities. If it succeeded, it meant that it was possible to build railways right through central London with minimal disturbance to the city above. Some saw the project as an engineering marvel. Others just saw great big pound signs. As early as 1886, there were groups proposing their own tube lines, 7, in fact, before the actual opening of the City in South London. One of these was a proposal for a line from Bayswater to the City via the West End, and it was to be called the Central London Railway. The CLR was a pretty good proposal, providing a rapid transport link between some of the busiest parts of London and being powered by clean, quiet electricity. The proposal was a little too good for some interests. Some of the loudest objections came from the Metropolitan and District Railways. These two companies ran the Inner Circle, which you would now know as the Circle Line, and which had only been completed 2 years previously. The Inner Circle also served the City, the West End, and the suburbs of West London, but took a fairly meandering route. In the 1860s, when they opened their first line, underground lines could only be built using the far more disruptive cut-and-cover method. Getting the circle completed had been a slow and expensive process. So you can see why they might not like the idea of a faster, more modern, more direct line horning in on their turf. Some of their arguments were sound, others less so. One of the big ones was that, well, the Central London Railway was horning in on their turf, and that would be in violation of the Act of Parliament that had authorised the Inner Circle. They also claimed that it would interfere with the Snow Hill Tunnel, which fed into the Metropolitan's line at Farringdon. They questioned the quality of the engineering. They argued that the CLR would do nothing that couldn't be done better by a bus. They said that this electricity malarkey was unproven, and if Parliament permitted this, the CLR would only come back in a couple of years to request authorisation to convert it all to steam power. All in all, the Met and the District considered the venture to be, in their words, purely speculative. Which does rather raise the question of why they were getting all worked up about it, but, whatever. The London, Chatham and Dover Railway, whose line ran through the aforementioned Snow Hill Tunnel, joined the Metropolitan in their objection to the line. But it wasn't just railways that were objecting. The Gas, Light and Coke Company complained that it would interfere with their gas pipes. Shop owners thought the line would draw custom away from their businesses. The City Corporation and landlords feared that it would damage buildings. So too did the various churches along the route, including St. Paul's Cathedral. When even God is against you, it's not a good sign. The counsel for the opposition came up with a somewhat bizarre but very Victorian argument that, and I quote, "There would be very considerable objection on the part of an elegantly dressed lady, we will say, to go down in one of those crowded lifts where she might possibly be between a chimney sweep on one side and a merchant of flour on the other." The CLR, of course, were quick to defend themselves. London had changed since the opening of the Metropolitan Railway, they argued. The roads were more gridlocked than they ever had been. Not only did the CLR offer advantages over a bus, but it could relieve traffic, and that could only help the commercial interests that were complaining. The line would be so far below the surface that it couldn't possibly damage the buildings up above, nor was there any possibility of vibration affecting the service. They were actually wrong on the last point, as it turned out, but in theory their argument was solid. Most damning of all, they were able to use the District Railway to demonstrate that you could build a railway without disturbing the soil. Besides, they said, no one had made these complaints about any other authorised underground line. What was so wrong with the Central London? So, on May the 13th, 1890, the House of Commons approved the bill. Now all it needed was the approval of the House of Lords, who threw it out. No CLR for you. The Railway Times was absolutely furious about the decision, thundering that faddism, aided by personal interest, has, for the time being at least, succeeded in shelving a scheme which, if carried out, would have been of immense convenience to the busy population of the metropolis. One of their biggest objections was that the Lords never stated exactly why they didn't endorse the bill, but simply stated that it was without merit. The CLR and its backers went back to the proverbial drawing board. Now, you may recall that I mentioned that there were 6 other proposals for deep-level tube lines. Well, one of these was the London Central Subway from Shepherd's Bush to Gower Street, running along Oxford Street. The London Central joined forces with the Central London, which must have been very confusing for whoever was writing the legal documentation up, and the bit from Bayswater to Shepherd's Bush was stuck on the end of the CLR route. The CLR also wanted to address the various complaints from the first time around. At the very next session of Parliament, they presented their new, improved bill, and this time it got through both houses. Work could begin on London's newest underground line. As we now know, the Central London Railway opened in 1900 and certainly did succeed. The opposition's argument that people of all classes would be forced together became a selling point on the new line, whose marketing made much of the flat fare of twopence. Vibrations were a problem due to the weight of the locomotives used in the early days, but this was resolved with the introduction of multiple units with better weight distribution. Stations were tiled in white to demonstrate the cleanliness of electric traction. Not only did electric traction work, but by the beginning of the 19th century it would be the Metropolitan and District who were applying to Parliament for permission to electrify. Eventually, the Central London Railway would be taken over by Underground Electric Railways of London, which in turn would be taken over by London Transport, who would rename it to the Central Line. As such, it's an essential part of London's transport network. You might say the CLR is central to it. Well, I hope you enjoyed this objectionable tale from the tube. If you did, please do click on the like button and consider subscribing for more. I'd like to thank my donors on Ko-fi and Patreon for your generous support. You are the London Central to my Central London. And I'll see you all again very soon for another tale from the tube.